If you were to see a burning building, accompanied by piercing shrieks and the rancid smell of scorched possessions, what would you do? Hopefully, you'd attempt to intervene either by calling for help or finding nearby resources to combat the ferocious blaze. But what if I told you that, by assuming the responsibility, you are ultimately rendering yourself the prime suspect? So what? You don't have anything to hide, or do you?
If you ask me, this was arson.
Arson?
Aye, someone arsing around. That's right, one of you lot.
In all seriousness, I should probably take this topic a bit more seriously. Iwao Hakamada was born on the 10th of March 1936 in Yuto, Shizuoka, a town located on the eastern banks of Lake Hamana. This period signalled a major territorial expansion of the Japanese Empire, with Manchuria having been annexed 5 years earlier in 1931, while just over a year later, in July 1937, Japan would launch a massive invasion of mainland China. Although only a child, Iwao effectively grew up in the backdrop of World War II, hardening him and instilling a ruthlessness which would serve him well as he grew older. Around his teenage years, his family relocated to Kawasaki, one of the main cities of the greater Tokyo area. Over the years, Tokyo has effectively been a conveyor belt for Japanese boxing talent, and this was no more obvious than in the late 1950s and early 1960s. First came Yoshio Shirai, then Masahiko Harada, followed by Hiroyuki Ibahara, all of which became world title holders. Iwao Hakamada was also hoovered up by Tokyo's boxing machine, making his senior boxing debut in November 1959, defeating Yutaka Kawaguchi on points. His boxing career would ebb along in twists and turns, accumulating 2 draws, 5 losses and 14 wins before the eve of 1961. Now, that's a ton of fights in a short space of time, but it was common for the period. After a tough points decision win against Iko Toritani, he was now ranked as Japan's 6th best boxer in the featherweight division. No mean feat considering the opposition he was up against in the likes of Harada and Ebihara. Only the top caliber of Japanese fighter would venture outside of the country at the time, and Hakamada achieved this goal, fighting Marsing David in the Philippines, where he sadly lost on points. He would retire at just 25, boasting a 16-11 record with 2 draws, yet impressively never having been knocked out. After his boxing career, he moved back to Shizuoka, opting to work in a miso manufacturing plant. Having worked there for several years, he was starting to make an honest wage and felt content. Little did he know that a seismic event was about to shake Japan to its core. On the 30th of June 1966, there was a fire at the home of one of Hakamada's bosses. With the fire taking place at 2 AM, Hakamada was sleeping alone in his dorm room, but when made aware, he swiftly sprang into action to help in tackling the inferno. Once the fire was put out, the bodies of Hakamada's boss, his wife, and 2 children were recovered, but they weren't charred. Instead, they had all been stabbed to death. About 200,000 yen in cash had also been stolen from the victim's residence. The finger was instantly pointed at Hakamada, and on the 18th of August 1966, he was arrested and detained in a police cell. You see, Hakamada had actually confessed to the murders. He did not have an alibi, no one had seen him when fighting the fire, and he had cuts on his middle finger and right shoulder, which police believed he sustained during the deed. The police displayed bokusa kuzure, a prejudiced attitude against former boxers, believing them to retain a willingness to use violence to solve problems, and after a tiny amount of blood and gasoline were found on a pair of pajamas he owned, it appeared to be an open and shut case. The former featherweight boxer must have murdered that family in cold blood, but, as with many things, all was not what it seemed. According to Hakamada's lawyers, the former boxer had been interrogated for a total of 264 hours, for as many as 16 hours a session, over 23 consecutive days to obtain a confession. They added that he was denied water or toilet breaks during the interrogation. He was effectively coerced into confessing. At the trial, Hakamada would staunchly retract his confession, saying that the police had kicked and clubbed him to initially obtain it, thus pleading not guilty. He outright stated, "I could do nothing but crouch down on the floor, trying to keep from defecating. One of the interrogators put my thumb onto an ink pad, drew it to a written confession record, and ordered me to write your name here, while he shouted at me, kicked me, and wrenched my arm." The trial proceeded with prosecutors putting aside the pajamas and instead presenting 5 pieces of bloody clothing that were found in a tank at the miso factory in August 1967, 14 months after the crime. They argued that the clothing came from the killer, being Hakamada, and said police had found the blood types of the victims on the clothing. Hakamada must have murdered the family in these clothes, then changed into pajamas to commit the arson, hence the gasoline stain. They also postulated that Hakamada had used a fruit knife with a 4.8-inch blade to commit the murders. Hakamada's defense responded vehemently, arguing that the case was full of holes. Firstly, Japanese fruit knives tend to be flimsy, so it could not have withstood the 40 stabbings of the victims without sustaining significant damage. Similarly, the pajamas originally used to justify the arrest had conveniently disappeared and been replaced with the bloody clothing. To add to this, the clothes were too small for Hakamada, but the prosecution argued that they had shrunk in the miso tank. The prosecution also claimed that the B label on the clothing indicated it was size medium and thus would have fit Hakamada. However, the B on the label indicated the colour black, not the shirt size. Moreover, the bloodstains on the clothes were too dark and the colour of the clothes too light to have been lying in the miso tank for a prolonged period of time. The Shizuoka District Court discounted part of Hakamada's confession and chided the police for their interrogation tactics. Nevertheless, on the 11th of September 1968, the 3-judge panel found Hakamada guilty and sentenced him to death. The Japan Pro Boxing Association alleged that prejudice against boxers was involved and said the principle of innocent until proven guilty had been violated because of rampant press reports declaring Hakamada guilty. To me, the facts do not suggest Hakamada was guilty beyond all reasonable doubt. Hakamada was understandably devastated, writing, "The verdict has been delivered and I have no choice but to call it a classic example of a miscarriage of justice." A subsequent appeal to the Tokyo High Court was denied and the Supreme Court of Japan upheld the death sentence on the 11th of November 1980. And yet, Hakamada eagerly awaited a retrial after filing a motion in April 1981. Not long after, the Supreme Court made a historic decision in what is now known as the Menda case. The top court ordered a new trial for Sakae Menda, who was sentenced to death for murdering a couple and seriously injuring their 2 daughters in Kumamoto Prefecture in 1948. Akin to Hakamada, Menda had been tortured and threatened into confessing to the crimes, charming yet again from the Japanese police. In 1983, Menda became Japan's first death row inmate to be proved innocent in a retrial. He had spent 34 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit. Evidently, these miscarriages did happen. By 1984, 2 more condemned prisoners in the Saitagawa and Matsuyama cases were exonerated in their retrials. Hakamada was further inspired in May 1986 when Shizuoka District Court granted a retrial to a man sentenced to death over the 1954 murder of a young girl in Shimada, Shizuoka Prefecture. He would write, "At long last, the judiciary brought justice in the Shimada case. Since I am in the same boat as those accused in the Menda, Saitagawa, Matsuyama and Shimada cases, I am now feeling relief, like seeing light in the dark. I will be the next to receive justice." He'd be sorely mistaken. Being perpetually imprisoned for a crime one did not commit seems awful enough, but Hakamada's experience was heavily worsened. In Japan, death row inmates are informed of their executions just a few hours before they are hanged. They wake up every morning dreading that this day could be their last. This horrific fact was echoed in Hakamada's letters. In December 1987, he wrote, "A death row inmate lives every single minute of the day with awareness of death. During the day, the fact that you are still alive makes you conscious of possible death tomorrow, and at night, you are made to fully grasp what despair is like in dreams of being dragged to the death chamber." Although Hakamada remained on death row, he was not executed because the Minister of Justice refused to sign his death warrant, suspecting the conviction was not certain. Like most death row inmates, Hakamada was placed in solitary confinement throughout his prison stay. He was not permitted to talk to guards and was rarely allowed visitors. At this point, his utter sense of loneliness and helplessness was evident, as he wrote, "Claims of innocence from prison are akin to frustrating efforts to try to see something beautiful in the darkness." Interestingly, across the other side of the globe, something similar was unfolding which Hakamada drew immense strength from. Reuben "Hurricane" Carter, a former US boxer who was sentenced to life imprisonment for a triple homicide in 1966, had his convictions overturned in 1985. Hakamada learned of Carter's acquittal through a magazine article he read in prison. In a letter to his sister, Hideko, he sounded elated about Carter's release. "As a fellow former professional boxer and a man wrongfully convicted, I now have the urge to chant Banzai from the window of my cell in the deepest corner of Japan's largest prison. Mr. Carter, I am so glad you have cleared your name. Congratulations." The magazine article about Carter was written by Makoto Maeda, the former editor-in-chief of the now-defunct boxing magazine. Maeda said he was a teenager when he saw Hakamada's bouts. He was a tough fighter who beat his opponents in the end by enduring their incessant attacks with a tenacity that matched what his first name, Iwao, stands for, he said. Reuben Carter had also learned about Hakamada's plight. In 2008, the Japan Pro Boxing Association hosted a special charity event for Hakamada's cause. In a videotaped message played at the event, Carter said, "Now is the time to free the Eastern Hurricane. Now is time to free Hakamada to show people that you are a civilized society. Free Mr. Hakamada now. Free all of us, because anytime one person is wrongly convicted and sentenced to prison, that's convicting all of us." Hakamada tried to stay hopeful for a retrial, but even his defense team had doubts. "We were convinced of his innocence, but it seemed exceedingly difficult to gain a new trial because we had been unable to find strong evidence to qualify for it," one of the lawyers recalled. In 2008, Hakamada's first motion for a new trial, filed in 1981, was rejected by the Supreme Court after 27 years. However, a 2008 DNA test suggested the blood on the clothing used as evidence did not match Hakamada's, prompting a second retrial request from his lawyers. Further tests in 2011 supported the conclusion. On the 14th of March 2012, a blood sample was taken from Hakamada for a more accurate DNA test to compare with the blood sample on the shoulder of the t-shirt found among the murderer's clothes. The testing revealed that the blood did not match Hakamada's DNA. On the 27th of March 2014, Hakamada was temporarily released from prison and granted a retrial by the Shizuoka District Court. On the 13th of March 2023, a retrial was ordered for Hakamada per the ruling of the Tokyo High Court. On the 26th of September 2024, Hakamada was acquitted by the Shizuoka District Court, 58 years after his arrest. A happy ending depending on how you choose to look at it. Yet Hakamada lost 58 years of his life, spending almost 30 of them in solitary confinement. This unimaginable cruelty obviously has troubling effects on the human psyche. Unsurprisingly, Hakamada's mental state had majorly deteriorated. An anti-death penalty activist that visited him in 2003 stated that Hakamada was then claiming he had become the omnipotent god who had absorbed Iwao Hakamada, taken over the prison, and abolished the death penalty in Japan. Some years later, in 2009, a psychiatric report diagnosed Hakamada with institutional psychosis. He was no longer fit to cope with the demands of the outside world and was now prone to mental health problems. At least justice was eventually restored, I guess. Amnesty International has featured Hakamada prominently in their campaign against the death penalty in Japan. Using his case and others, they argued Japan's death row system is driving prisoners into the depths of mental illness. If you'd like to help to avoid situations such as Hakamada's from reoccurring, it might be worth donating to Amnesty International, link is down below. It's an organisation that basically fights for human rights against injustice and inequality. On a personal note, this whole ordeal is utterly heartbreaking. Hakamada is now 88 years old, he's lost out on the greater proportion of his life and is going senile by many accounts. Just the miscarriage of justice is astonishing. Yesterday, Associated Press posted a video of the Shizuoka Japanese chief of police apologising to Hakamada and his sister. His sister then informs the police that they are not planning to file a complaint. Well, I guess if after all that the Hakamadas are willing to forgive, then maybe I should absolve my dad of any blame for vanishing after going out to fetch some milk 15 years ago. I hope he at least lives out his final days with an element of satisfaction and happiness, but this doesn't seem to be likely. If you guys enjoyed this different type of boxing video, despite it being very depressing, please leave a like as I've got similar boxing crime scenarios in the pipeline. Also, please let me know your thoughts about the ordeal in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Please consider liking and subscribing, it means the most. Also, why not follow me on Patreon? Link is down below in the description. Thanks again, and cheers.